Well, welcome. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome everybody. This is our third speaker series. I can't believe that time is really marching along. So my name is Filio Cushing. I have the privilege of being the president of the board of the Manchester by the Sea Museum. I wanted to just take a few minutes just to talk about the things that we've accomplished this year. But before I do that, I would be remiss if I didn't thank, and I think we owe a little bit of applause for our program committee, who's done a really amazing job. Everything soup to nuts, getting us organized, the beautiful food, the organization. I'm impressed. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit, and I also want to thank our board. We have 15 members on our board. And this has been a year where everybody has rolled up their sleeves and really contributed phenomenally. So I am really proud of everybody's contributions. So it has been a great year, and we've accomplished a lot. Our permanent exhibit rooms all have been reconfigured to tell Manchester stories. Stories such as our incredible furniture making era with more than 43 mills and cabinet making shops. The inspiring stories of Abigail Hooper Trask and Captain Richard Trask, Manchester's first power couple. We have also been hard at work on our upcoming summer exhibit and lecture, Summers by the Sea, Masconomo House, Hotel, and Resort Era. The event is Thursday, May 30th. If you haven't done already, please go online and register. And while you're there, if you aren't a member, which I have a hard time believing, but join me. That's the time to do it. That should be a wonderful evening. And to kick things off, Corey, if you're here, of 1623 Studios will give a lecture at 7 p.m. Corey will explore the resort era movement and summer life in Manchester. He will provide a look at the Booth family, proprieties of the majestic Masconomo House Hotel, and share the history of Lexington Avenue, the area's fashionable shopping destination that rivaled New York's Fifth Avenue. This show is going to be so important because it has been curated by our own curatorial staff. So that is really impressive. So I hope you all come over and see it. So Becca Campbell, Sue Thompson, Matt Genta, Carol Bundy. Wonderful. They have been working day and night, so don't miss it. So after the lecture, Corey's lecture, invites the unveiling of our summer exhibit. We will also have another event at beautiful Shark's Mouth. Last year's event was wonderful. This is going to be Wednesday, June 25th. Go back to the website. Please sign up. Arthur Shercliffe, we're really excited that Arthur Shercliffe is going to come, and he's going to talk about the brief history of the Longfellow, Dana, and Curtis family in the 19th century here in town. We also have some terrific new volunteers. We also have been improving our archives. We are reconfiguring our archival space to improve functionality. And we are hard at work on the digitization project so that we can provide the public online access to our archives. We were able to accomplish all of this thanks to many of your generosity. If you haven't already given to our bicentennial campaign or our annual appeal, which is ongoing, please consider a gift online. And for those who have donated, really huge thanks. So now, the reason that you're all here, I have the pleasure of introducing Doug Stewart to you. Doug Stewart is a writer and longtime Ipswich resident who has written more than 60 feature stories for Smithsonian Magazine. Since retiring, Doug has taught English as a second language and leads tours at the Cape Ann Museum. He occasionally lectures on subjects that he researched in depth for Smithsonian, such as Essex County's role in the early American China trade. In 2010, he published a book about a real-life literary imposter, the boy who would be Shakespeare, a tale of forgery and folly. Until the pandemic, Doug and his wife, writer and photographer Coco McCabe, wrote restaurant reviews together for the Boston Sunday Globe. So it's my pleasure to introduce Doug. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. you all for coming. Let me just raise this a little bit. How's the sound?
Perfect.
Yeah, sure. So I should start out by saying I'm not a historian. I'm a writer, former freelance writer. So I'm really not an authority. You might think, well, why am I talking about the China trade? So I once wrote a Smithsonian story about the China trade, but then I've continued to do research and reading, and it's great to live in Essex County because this is the heart of it. And there are so many artifacts, buildings, monuments, and miscellaneous that's still connected to the trade. And I feel like I keep learning about it. So this, of course, is the Boston Tea Party, not the original, the reenactment. Has anyone here ever thrown tea in the Boston Harbor? Pull it back with a rope, okay. So there's a lot of history in the Boston Tea Party, but you might ask, why were the colonists so furious with the British because of the situation with tea? And I think the underlying problem was tea was really expensive because Americans, or the colonists, had to get it from England. The tea was coming from China, going to England, being re-exported to the 13 colonies. And it was expensive, it was coming in late. I guess it got stale, although I'm not sure I could judge stale tea. As soon as the revolution ended in 1783, colonists started getting ready to send merchant ships to Asia, which England had not allowed us to do while we were English citizens. We could sail to the West Indies, we couldn't sail to the East Indies. So, I call this the China trade. That's the way people refer to it. But 200 years ago, people called it the East India trade. And East India was not just India, but Indochina, the Malay archipelago, and then China over here. So if you look at the coast of India, the coast of Sumatra, you just notice hundreds of ports, all perfectly labeled. The sea captains knew all those ports. Until you get to China, it's empty. Just says part of China, and the coast bumps along a little while and then disappears in that little inlet, which is the Pearl River. And at the head of the Pearl River is Canton, which is the only part of China open to foreigners. So, and this was, there was a huge rush to get products from Asia. Now, Samuel Eliot Morris, an American historian, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, 100 years ago wrote that Boston is the Spain and Salem the Portugal in the race for Oriental opulence, which is the way it felt like in 1800. So this is the city seal of the city of Salem. Has anyone ever looked at this before? Yeah, it's painted on the sides of buildings. Now you might think the city seal for Salem would have a witch, right? Or maybe a Puritan with buckled shoes or something. That's a Sumatran in a silk robe and curly-toed slippers, and he's got a palm tree next to him. And in the distance, on the right, you can't see it here, there's a volcano. This is Bande Aceh, where the huge earthquake was 20 years ago at the northwest tip of Sumatra. This is the so-called pepper coast. There was so much pepper imported starting after the American Revolution that Salem became the wealthiest city in the country per capita for a while there. And that's the thing about these towns on the north shore of Massachusetts. New York is bigger and Boston's bigger, but Salem and Beverly and Gloucester were much smaller, and therefore the impact of this wealth that came in was much greater. Really colored what went on. And so it wasn't just China, it was Sumatra. Ships went to, from Salem and other Massachusetts ports, they went to Zanzibar for gold dust, ivory. They went to the Dutch East Indies for nutmeg, cinnamon, other spices, so-called spice islands. They went to Cape Town. They got wine, currants, and things like that. But especially they went to China. And in China, the big products were tea, porcelain, and silk. So here's a close-up of the Pearl River Delta, which still exists, although this is all paved over at this point. That's the Pearl River mouth. There's Macau, which was a Portuguese colony. And on the other side of the Pearl River is Hong Kong. And then up past Lincoln Island, there's Whampoa and Canton. And that was the Shangri-La that everyone wanted to get to. And I want to read a quote from the Emperor of China. This is a translation from a document he sent the King of England, George III, in 1793. This is the words of the Emperor, as translated by an unknown British translator that I can't vouch for since I don't speak Chinese. Our empire produces all that we ourselves need, but since our tea, rhubarb, and silk seem to be necessary to the very existence of the barbarous Western peoples, we will, imitating the clemency of heaven, who tolerates all sorts of fools on this globe, condescend to allow a limited amount of trading through the port of Canton. To me, that sounds like Gilbert and Sullivan. I think as I think about it, I think that translator was some anti-Chinese English guy 200 years ago. I can't believe that's exactly what it would have come across like in Chinese. So this is the major figure after the revolution in Salem. This is Elias Haskett Derby. He was known as King Darby around Salem. He had a whole fleet of ships, had privateers during the Revolution, and then his fleet just got bigger. He was the first Massachusetts person to send a ship to China, the Grand Turk. There'd been a couple earlier ships from, I think, New York and maybe Baltimore. He had one blue eye, one brown eye, had a gold-headed cane, 6 feet tall, and he sent ships all over the world. When he died in 1799, he was probably the richest man in this country. One thing I should emphasize is, yeah, there were rich people here in colonial America, but they were rich because they had a lot of land. The land might have come from, a king's grant. Jefferson and Washington had huge plantations, but they were always hurting for money. This was the first group of people to be millionaires in America. The first group of real risk-seeking capitalist financiers. They were betting their fortunes on sending these ships around the world, which is extremely dangerous. And some of them lost everything, and those people mostly are lost to history. The people we know about and the people I'll talk about are the ones who succeeded and did make a fortune. And some of these people made so much money they didn't know what to do with it. Like Derby, by the way. I mean, he had a summer place in Salem, West Salem, that was, 1,000 acres. He had 2,000 merino sheep. He had greenhouses with orange trees. He had a hermitage that Reverend Bentley of Salem wrote about visiting with a hermit. And the writer went and visited, and the hermit came out, or they went into the hermitage, and he was reading like the Book of Common Prayer. You know, he'd been hired for the job. That is a wealthy guy when you can start hiring hermits. So this also, the other thing about, I should say East India trade, now China trade, because most of the goods in volume came from India. It was the most valuable goods that came from China. China is where people wanted to go if they had the connections and the staying power to get there. But a lot more material is coming here from India. This is a typical inventory. It's a newspaper ad from 1791 when one of Derby's ships arrived in Salem, and they'd have an auction on the wharf. Or in a store right across from Derby Wharf. And you can see, handkerchiefs, striped cottons, chintzes, all this kind of stuff. This is 1797. There were no textile mills in America yet. The first integrated cotton mill wasn't until 1812 in Waltham. If you wanted cloth, you either imported it from England, say, or you made it yourself at home. That was called homespun. That's what most people wore in colonial times. So it was great to now be able to get all this cloth direct from India, which looked like, this is from the collection of the PBS Institute Museum. That's ship captains would bring samples back, and then families would order from the samples. So that's plain cotton, top left, and clockwise, it's a block printed silk handkerchief, and then a printed cotton bedspread, and a purple silk handkerchief. This was fancy stuff, but it was cheap. So it was very exciting to the market here. So Derby was big man in Salem, but there was a counterweight to the Derbys. And it wasn't just Derby, it was these children. One thing I forgot to mention about the Derby's farm, it's now the North Shore Mall. Yeah. So this is Jacob Crowninshield. The Crowninshields were the other big family that ran Salem circa 1800, 1810. Jacob was one of 6 brothers, was a very adept seaman. He was tapped by President Jefferson to be Secretary of the Navy. He turned Jefferson down and said, "You can pick my brother Benjamin." So Benjamin was Secretary of the Navy. And these guys were very sharp. They were not only good sailors, they were good businessmen. So this is an ad for an elephant Jacob Crowninshield brought back to America. He bought it in India for $450, exhibited it, paid 25 cents for adults and less for kids. Reverend Bentley said he couldn't even see the elephant, there were so many people. So $450 to buy the elephant, he sold it in New York for $10,000. So that's a 2,000% profit, I think. Now this is the first inventory of the East Indian Marine Society in Salem. And this was a society, a kind of private club of mariners from Salem. To be a member of the East Indian Marine Society, you had to sail around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope. And all members were charged to bring back curiosities, either artificial or natural. So this is from the first inventory in 1821. And I love some of this stuff. A fishing line made of the intestines of an animal. And these things used to be in wooden cases in the original Peabody Museum, which is now the Peabody Essex Museum. Several swallows' nests from Sumatra, eaten by the Chinese in soups. And it goes on and on. There was a penguin that was stuffed with a long neck. So it was all very well to bring back curiosities, but the reason for this society, the reason for risking your neck by sailing around the world, and to sail to China or Southeast Asia and come back is essentially sailing around the world. People wanted to get rich, and they wanted to get rich fast, and they did. The successful ones did. You could do 2 trips to Sumatra or China and come back and retire and run for Congress. And people did, they really did. Like Jacob Crowninshield, I mean, that picture, he was already a very successful guy. So pepper was the big thing that Salem really had a monopoly on for a number of years. I'm not quite clear on why it was in such demand. I think it was more than a spice. Some people said it was to preserve food in an era before refrigeration. Possibly, it might have also been to disguise the flavor of decomposing meat. But it was popular, and the first Salem captain to find pepper growing wild in Sumatra was Jonathan Carnes. He brought back this pepper, which he found in a secret place, because I guess people hadn't figured out how to cultivate pepper. So finding it wild was a real godsend. He had sacks filling the hold on deck, and he sold it for 7 times the cost of the voyage. I mean, 700% return on investment. And there was once a story about how a Malay was on the coast looking at all these Salem boats at anchor off one of the coves in Sumatra, because Carnes tried to keep secret where he found the pepper. Eventually, other Salem skippers found out, but people didn't generally find out. So Malay looked at all these Salem vessels and said, "Salem must be a great nation." So this would be, this is the Friendship, which I don't know if it's still, they were working on it. It's usually at Derby Wharf in Salem. As a blueprint, when it was rebuilt 20 years ago, they used a ship's model built by the original Friendship's ship's carpenter. And the model used to sit in a sort of bathtub in the banquet hall at East India Marine Hall. It had little cannons that would fire for toast. Anyway, this is like 130 feet long. It doesn't look very big. It's much bigger than the average American East India vessel. English ships are big. American ships tend to be under 100 feet. They were more maneuverable. They could go in shallower coves and so on. If people have questions, you can just sing out. I don't have a memorized speech. And so here's a little local color. Anybody recognize this place? Baker's Island. Very good. Baker's Island here in Manchester by the Sea. And on the northwest tip of Baker's Island, and let me find where I am. I like to use notes because otherwise I can start either digressing or making stuff up. So I think 1817, the ship Union, which is looking for Boston Harbor, went aground on the northwest tip of Baker's Island. It was loaded with pepper from Sumatra. And it was the boat was a total loss, but a lot of the pepper was on the rocks, might have been shallow water, and there was an emergency call. 40 men from Marblehead, Manchester, Beverly, all came out during the night, starting in the night, to try to salvage the pepper. And there were 1,600 sacks were salvaged, which was less than half the total. So it was it was valuable, and maybe salt and pepper together wasn't so bad, I don't know. I would think it'd be ruined. Yeah. Also, there was an inquest, and the captain testified. They said, "How could you lose the boat like that, you fool?" And he said, "Look, when we left a year ago, there was one light at the entrance to the Beverly-Salem Channel, and now there's 2. And when I left, 2 meant Boston. I thought I was entering Boston Harbor. And it's the federal government that controls the lights. But if you're gone for a year or 2, how do you know? One thing that was rescued was the Union's figurehead. And there's a little I'm sorry about this picture. I couldn't see it from the road when I tried to sneak over, but I found the real estate ad. And there's the figurehead facing the water. So somebody salvaged the figurehead. Now it's on a house in Marblehead. So here's a Chinese watercolor from about 1800 of Canton. It's very interesting. So this is the Pearl River, and this section, sort of terraced area, a few hundred yards wide, was the only part of China Westerners were allowed to set foot in. That had been true for centuries. The Chinese, or the emperor, was very suspicious of the designs of the European powers, which is very smart, as it turned out. And those Western-style buildings were called factories, or hongs. Factories meaning where factors were. So they were a combination counting house, storehouse, and on the second floor were rooms, like dormitories, where the visitors could sleep for maybe 2 weeks max. Captains could come ashore here, supercargos. Supercargos are the business managers on a trip. Sometimes the captain is the supercargo. Regular sailors had to stay on board. Of course, they could have stopped in Macau. I think they had to on the way up, which was Portuguese. But here they could not come ashore. And yeah, the security was pretty tight. And you'll notice it's all Chinese boats. There's no Western boats. The boats had to anchor about 10 miles downstream. So the Chinese were really trying to keep the Americans and British and others at arm's length. So this is the inside of one of the hongs. This is a tea place where these workers are packing tea with their feet. I don't really understand the logic. I would think you put a board and step on the board, but maybe something about manipulating the tea with your toes makes it better. I don't know. I mean, really, I don't know. Because they had plenty of experience packing tea, and this was the way. And you'll notice with all those people, there's only one Westerner, the guy with tails on the left. So they really, really were trying to keep control of the operation. And tea was really in demand, I've got to say. It was called that exhilarating beverage, according to Reverend Bentley. It was considered to be therapeutic, and it had become hugely popular in England, in this country, and elsewhere. And you think about, the expression, I wouldn't do that for all the tea in China, where it must be that people on the waterfront here were seeing one ship after another arriving with tea, and thinking, do people in China do anything besides grow tea all the time? And it dwarfed anything we were sending to China. So here's a tea chest from China, and you'll notice the keyhole. Why do you think there'd be a keyhole in a tea chest? Yeah, like marijuana, like high-grade marijuana. You didn't want your servants or even your kids helping. Yeah. I mean, I guess this is just, I like to conjecture. You see the keyhole and you think, what? Yeah, so this is a Nanking blue and white teapot. One thing I should point out, a lot of this stuff was really designed and sold for the export market. This isn't what anybody drank tea out of in China. Tea is a Chinese beverage, but they don't pour it out of these English-style pots. But this was what the market wanted, so the Chinese made it. And here's some pink lusterware, hand-painted, at the Hale House in Beverly. And you could get 50-piece tea service in 1800 for $3. So this was nice stuff, better than anything that was made in England, certainly better than anything made here. I don't know if we even made porcelain in 1800. But affordable. So even a prosperous farm family might have Canton china on the shelves. They may not eat off of it, but they could buy it. And so the tea, ceramics, and then silk is the third big high-volume product that people got from China. I think of this is a watercolor from China. It's part of a book talking about Chinese crafts. I think of this as pure propaganda. This is from early 1800s, and it makes textile work look like a heavenly pastime. Because they've even got little boys playing with the silkworms on a palm leaf. Isn't that sweet? And this is just about the year William Blake wrote Jerusalem, a poem about Jesus coming back to earth, visiting England, and writing about the dark satanic skies of Manchester. And what have you done with your coal-fired cotton mills? That was part of the allure of this whole market was it seemed like China was Xanadu. Not only were all these extravagant goods coming, but they must be coming from a real beautiful place where people dressed in silk and sip tea out of Canton China cups and a light would show through. In fact, there were hundreds of thousands of poorly paid workers outside Canton. That was one of the things the Chinese didn't want the Westerners to see, is all the kilns and the looms and the work going on to produce all this material. So this is an example of hand-painted silk. And this is actually from Manchester by the Sea. This was it was intended as wallpaper. It was used as a screen in what might have been the first summer house here in Manchester, built by Robert Bennett Forbes, the China trader in I forget when, 1850, something like that. He bought several acres at one side of, I guess, way out in West Manchester. And there's other things like this, like at Beauport in Gloucester, there's a China trade room with all this hand-painted silk. Actually, a lot of China trade houses. The Cushing Museum in Newburyport is a China trade room. Of course, the Forbes Museum in Milton has one. Gloucester has the back parlor of the Captain Elias Davis house. The Hurd House in Ipswich was a China trade room. So aside from silk, porcelain, and tea, there were a lot of specialty items, usually lumped together as export art, but some of them were kind of souvenirs. So this is a bowl and a fan with images of the Hong. It's a pewter tankard. So this wouldn't have been of interest generally. This would be a souvenir for people who went to China. And the thing is, they'd go to China and all they got to see was the banks of the Pearl River. They wouldn't really see China. So if they wanted souvenirs, they got souvenirs of what they'd seen. That would be that little section of waterfront in Canton. Another specialty item were paintings. And the Chinese artists were amazing. They were very talented. Like the teapots, this is not Chinese-style painting. These were painters trained by probably George Chinnery or some other Western painter so that they could paint in a style that appealed to the ship captains and supercargoes or their wives. This is Martha Wheatley of Salem. I don't think she was in China, but her husband, Captain Wheatley, probably left a locket with a workshop in Canton and said, I'll be back in 2 weeks when we're leaving. And they would blow it up into a full-size portrait using her face on the locket and then faking the rest, which is one reason it's so little detail. And that was about 1800. This is 1850. This is Constance Phippen of Beverly, wife of Captain Oliver Griffin Lane of Ennisquam. Apparently, Lane brought a daguerreotype, or maybe a tintype, of his wife, left it in a shop, and they did this beautiful watercolor on ivory that I bet is more lifelike than the original daguerreotype. I mean, it's just amazing. And I just photographed this out of a book, so to see the real thing. It was probably very affordable and done quickly. So here's Robert Bennett Forbes himself, Black Ben. He was one of the most famous and successful of the China traders, part of the Forbes family. His uncle was a big mover and shaker in Boston, Thomas Handyside Perkins. And he went to work for his uncle as a boy. I was just before the talk over at the library, and they have a copy of Personal Reminiscences, Cushing's autobiography. First chapter is talking about school. He hasn't even finished school. I don't know, he's a kid. He's been captured 3 times on boats by British ships and getting away each time. Not just him, but he's on voyages, constantly being attacked by pirates. And then anyway, he was very successful and lived in China for quite a while. Now, I don't know how he did that, because Westerners weren't supposed to be able to stay in China. Possibly he stayed in Macau. Macau also is where they had a Catholic church. They had Western cemetery. If you died in Canton, you could be buried in Macau. You wouldn't be buried in Canton. And by the way, this is a painting by a Chinese painter. I forget the name. And this, in my imagination, is his first cousin. In the center of the picture in white, where's my pointer? Prove me wrong. John Perkins Cushing. Because this is a painting by a British painter, William Daniel, about 1805. And there aren't supposed to be Western boats, but I see 2 Western-rigged boats. And John Perkins Cushing was another nephew of Thomas Handyside Perkins, worked with Robert Bennett Forbes, who was younger. Perkins was older. Perkins lived in China for like 25 years. And this was 2 years after he first arrived as a young man. He was known to love sailboat racing. He's supposed to be, he and Black Ben were in the first documented yacht race in America, supposedly, off Marblehead in the 1830s. And the 2 cousins were scolded for racing in the water off of Canton because nobody else was doing that. And they were treating it as a hoot. There are no pictures of John Perkins Cushing. So I'm using this. After 25 years, he came back to Boston, probably the wealthiest person in town. He was, I think, 37, very, very eligible bachelor. Built a mansion for himself about where Park Street Station is. Had a wall around it covered with Chinese tiles. Inside it was like a Chinese art museum with sculptures of jade and ivory. He wore silk clothes and slippers and all these Chinese servants. It's quite something. I would have liked to see that. So one way that they might have, the 2 of them might have been able to stay in China a long time. And again, I'm full of conjectures. I'm probably wrong. But what the hell? It's fun to think about what might be. This is Hokwa or Haokwa, H-O-U-Q-U-A. Q-U-A is just an honorific. I forget his Chinese name. He was one of a dozen so-called Kohongs, who were people appointed by the emperor, who was almost 1,000 miles away in Peking, to be the intermediary for all Western trades. So when Westerns arrived in Canton, they weren't allowed to make deals with local merchants. You had to deal with someone like Hokwa. Hokwa was the most powerful of them. And he never wrote things down. He just had deals. If he liked you, he might say, okay, you owe me $100,000, but let's just not worry about it. You can give me something next time you come. He gave Forbes money to invest in the railroad building in New York State. It was incredible. When he died in the late 1830s, he was thought to be, he had $26 million, richest man in China, therefore probably the richest man in the world. And this picture I took in the Ipswich library when I moved to Ipswich 40 years ago. I thought, why is this Chinese gentleman's portrait right here in the, behind the circulation desk? And the library was endowed by our own China trader, Augustine Hurd. And I think Hokwa would give out these paintings as like calling cards to their trading partners. There's one just like it at the Forbes Museum in Milton. There's one like it at the Cushing House in Newburyport and so on. But it's a very cool portrait. And he was loved. I mean, I saw a poem once in a library, research library, by a captain. It was like a love poem, saying how much he loved Hokwa. So anyway, there was so much tea coming here, and silk and porcelain. There needed to be silver is what the Chinese wanted. They were not interested in lumber. They weren't interested in turpentine. They weren't interested in rope. They wanted silver because everybody likes silver. So Americans tried other kinds of exchange goods like sandalwood, ginseng, bêche de mer, or sea cucumbers, used in Chinese cuisine, and sea otter pelts, which the Chinese love and were willing to pay a lot for. But still, that was not really enough. It didn't make a dent in the trade imbalance. So this is what the Chinese wanted. We didn't make silver dollars yet, so these are Spanish milled dollars used in Mexico. And a lot of the banks here are concerned about all the money going to China. And the import duties being paid in Salem alone on goods from the China trade amounted to, I think, 15% of all federal revenue in 1805. That's before income tax. But even so, it was a lot of money. And also, a boat coming back from the West Indies loaded with cargo, like molasses, might pay $700 in duties. A boat coming from China might pay $15,000, $20,000, $25,000. So that's an indication of the proportional value of these cargoes. So these are a few China trade mansions. Top left and clockwise. Anybody recognize the top left house? Yes?
Beverly City Hall.
That's right. And who used to live there?
Well, let's see, there was Andrew Cabot was the first, and then there was the Colonel, Israel Thorndike.
That's right. Good. And somebody here is married to his descendants. I forget who. Oh, yeah. So Israel Thorndike is today at Beverly City Hall. There's a China trader. Top right, it's our Hurd House in Ipswich. Original house built by John Hurd and his son Augustus, and greatly expanded it. Bottom right is outside Essex County. That's the Oliver Lyman House in Waltham, that I think is historic New England's headquarters, maybe. Bottom left, the Gardner Pingree House on Essex Street in Salem. And that's what I say, I like to keep learning about the China trade. It's great to go to these houses, see the stuff, and learn about the history. And finding out about the hermit and the hermitage. So this is inside the Gardner Pingree House, where everything that can be carved is carved by Samuel McIntyre. When I give tours in the Elias Davis House in Gloucester, built the same year, I'll say, this is pretty nice woodwork, but have you been to Salem? And here's another example of over-the-top spending. This is a tea house that was part of the King Darby estate in Salem. I think it's where Old Town Hall is now. It was pulled down in the early 1800s. And in the style of a Pompeian building. Pompeii had just been rediscovered a generation before. Samuel McIntyre designed this too. Why you would need a two-story building to drink tea, I don't know. So the building's gone. This was saved, and I took this picture of John Magna and Danvers Historical Society. This is the Forbes Mansion in Milton, with the sort of Robert Bennett Forbes' own idea of what a Chinese architecture should look like. And one other thing, so Robert Bennett Forbes made a ton of money, came back here in the 1830s, lost all of it or most of it in the Panic of 1837, went back to China, came back a few years later with a new fortune. His brother, John Murray Forbes, was similar, came back with a fortune. He bought this island for cash, that's Nisham. You can't go there unless you're a Forbes. I found out when I was a kid, I sailed there in a little boat, a guy came out onto the dock and said, you can't land here. I'm sorry, there are probably Forbeses here. I'm not against it. All right, so this is how they did it. You know, you say, how do you just keep going back and coming back with another fortune if you lose it on the US stock market? You sell opium. And that's the key to the rebound of this trade because, yeah, there was a trade imbalance. It was terrible until the British in the late 1700s, followed by the Americans, started bringing massive amounts of opium to Canton. And later, up all the rivers of China, created millions of addicts. The Chinese have been very standoffish. You know, they say, yeah, we'll buy your sandalwood, but otherwise we want silver dollars. But when opium created its own market, now people are waiting for the ships to arrive. You know, we need a fix. This is another British, I think William Daniel again. Kind of an imaginary view of an opium den. I don't believe they're this bright. I don't believe they had such tall ceilings. But it was the Western view. You think of opium dens as some kind of traditional Chinese pastime. No, the British started it. And the British didn't let us buy opium in India, which is where it was coming from. The Brits had a well-oiled industrial machine in Patna with huge warehouses, quality control inspectors, fleets of ships constantly going from Calcutta to Canton. Americans were kept away because England controlled India. So they realized they could go to Smyrna in Turkey. And there was a regular trade of boats going all the way the length of the Mediterranean, from Gibraltar to the Aegean coast of Turkey. Smyrna is modern-day Izmir. Pick up opium and sail all the way back out. And you can see here, American flag, I think that's an American flag. A lot of American boats. And if it wasn't for opium, I don't know why they'd be in Smyrna. And then they'd sail it out and then go all the way around Cape of Good Hope. The whole continent of Africa, across the Indian Ocean and over to Canton. So, anybody recognize this gentleman? This painting is in the Manchester Museum. You all should go there tomorrow, get a tour. This is Captain Thomas Leach. There were two. I found out this morning from Matthew. Father and son. This is the father. And he was an intrepid sailor who sailed to China and elsewhere for many years, as did his son. Who? Captain Thomas Leach of Manchester by the Sea. He spent his life here. And when I was here years ago, John Huss was the director, and he let me go into the archives and look at old sailors' logs. I took a picture of this page from Captain Leach's ship's logs aboard as master of the Henry Eubank in 1826. And it gives you an idea of what a ship would leave here with. So you would leave here with things that were cheap and abundant, and then trade them on the way. So you're constantly turning over your cargo, so you had a lot of silver. And by the end, you'd want to arrive in Canton with silver. So leaving here, Leach had crates of muskets, 38 casks brandy, 40 boxes whale oil candles, 75 canisters turpentine, 32 coils of rope, that kind of thing. And then I was looking at this 2 nights ago, because it's an old picture from 8 years ago, and I was trying to read the writing. Did anybody read that? No? How about that? Our own Captain Leach, drug lord. 4 cases of opium. So he's leaving here with opium. And I thought, well, why would he do that? And I figure, and this is kind of in the book I was reading an hour ago, he would say, he would take on cargo, he'd turn it over, he'd sell it, he'd hold back if the price wasn't right. And I can also imagine if you sailed to Izmir, to Smyrna, and all the way back out to Gibraltar, and you're supposed to go all the way around Africa, you might just say, look, I'm 3 weeks from Boston, I'm going to sail home, the opium will keep. Or you get to Canton, and 3 huge British ships have just arrived with opium, and the prices collapse. You say, oh, I'll wait till next time. So he said, 4 cases of opium kicking around. So the Opium War started in 1839. Opium was illegal, had been since the 1700s. The death for selling opium was, I think, death by strangulation. Teaching Chinese to a Westerner, death. Teaching how to make silk, death. There were a lot of ways that China was trying to keep control of what was going on. So the new viceroy in 1839 seized British stores of opium, and the British were outraged, and they brought in the gunships. And after that, China was broken wide open. England got Hong Kong. Shanghai was opened up. I think 4 treaty ports, and everything changed. This is Russell Sturgis. There are many Russell Sturgises. Do we have a Russell Sturgis here? I was sure there would be one. Anyway, I was doing research on this. It was so hard because they're all named Russell Sturgis. Not even Junior, it's just Russell Sturgis. So he was a partner of Black Ben. He was 3 years younger, and but he was deeply involved in opium trade. He was a partner with Robert Bennett Forbes in Russell and Company, which is #1 opium seller in the U.S. 2 of his uncles were opium sellers. And Sturgis had a home in Macau. He lived in China during the 1830s, and later he was a banker for Baring Brothers in England. And you know, when you read the histories, you hear about Baring Bank, you don't hear so much about other things. Or the fact that another head of Russell and Company was a guy named Warren Delano. Ever hear of him? Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. And I just read an old article, a column by Eleanor Roosevelt denying that her husband's grandfather did more than Delano. I mean, that guy was a drug lord. And this is, the earlier Russell Sturgis had good sideburns. His son had better sideburns. This is also Russell Sturgis. So he was, might have been born in Manchester by the Sea. It's a genealogy site that claims 1831. I don't think that's true. But he retired here. He went to China when he was 21 or 22 in the 1850s. He was connected with the U.S. consulate in Shanghai, because now we had all this kind of connections in China, thanks to the Opium War, if you want to say thanks. And he retired at 30 after working in the consulate for less than 10 years. A wealthy man. And came back, bought 8 acres on Smith's Point in Manchester. And I don't think the wealth he got in those years was accumulated consular wages. But what do I know? This is the house he built called Sunny Waters on Mascanoma Street. I think it still exists. They lifted it up, right, and put in another floor. Yeah. 2 more characters, almost at the end. 2 guys that I find very interesting. They're partners. Augustine Hurd of Ipswich on the left, and that's Joseph Coolidge on the right. And they were partners at Hurd and Company, I think in the 1840s. Earlier, Coolidge had been another partner of Robert Bennett Forbes. So, elbow deep in opium, believe it. And they used to say in Ipswich that the herds just dabbled in opium. And I read that the old library director told me that at one point the herd and company had 2.5 million pounds of opium in hulks in the Yangtze River off Shanghai around 1860. Hulks would be dismasted boats that were used as floating warehouses, giving traders plausible deniability. They'd say, we didn't import opium, it didn't come ashore. It's like the casino in Biloxi, floating in 4 feet of water, so it's not subject to Mississippi's anti-gambling tax. So, Joseph Coolidge sort of pioneered getting Americans to bring Indian opium to China. And this is Joseph's son, Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, who's painting. I was just looking at the library. Yeah, on stained glass. Yeah, he endowed a lot of things here. Now, I don't want to slander T. Jefferson Coolidge, but he was involved in the China trade in the 1850s, like his dad. And did his dad teach him the ropes? I don't know. But he also was involved in lots of other businesses. Textile mills, banking, railroads, so who knows. But he also made a fortune. And this is a picture I just found online of one of the dining rooms at the so-called Marble Palace. Do people know that? Yeah. Okay. It used to be on Coolidge Point. Yeah, it got knocked down in the 1950s. So this was a house the Coolidge family built, designed by Charles McKim, family friend. And I just show it because you see all this chinoiserie. I think the rattan chairs. There used to be a rattan furniture store on one of the side streets in Canton early on. Right after the Revolution, one of the first ships brought back a lot of rattan furniture from Canton. Chinese porcelain, screens, maybe that ornamented glass door. So it's an example of the impact of connections with China here. But by the late 1800s, I think the bloom was off the rose. The China trade was no longer any kind of golden age. The trade didn't stop. It got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. The boats got bigger and faster, but it didn't have that cachet of having a 80-foot boat full of incredibly valuable pepper. This is the last sailing ship to go to Asia, the Panay, in 1887, carrying turpentine to Manila, came back with sugar. And if you talk about the China trade today, you got to look at this. The Costco Guangzhou. Guangzhou is the modern name for Canton. It's still the biggest port. I think it's the biggest container port in the world. And there's still that same problem of a trade imbalance, all this money going to China. If you bought a refrigerator, if you bought a t-shirt, it probably came down the road. So I'll just end with this so we don't have to look at that container ship. So if you have questions, I'll try to answer them. We can turn the lights on. And again, I'm not a historian. I like to, conjecture, like about John Perkins Cushing. That's probably not him in that boat.
Try to sail here, and did any of the China trade folk bring Chinese folk here to your knowledge?
Yeah, well, there's two answers. The second part first, yeah, because when I do the tour in Gloucester of the Captain Elias Davis house, I talk about things that Captain Day, the second owner, brought back from China, which are all around the room. I'll say one unexpected thing he brought was a young stowaway from Shanghai. And here he is in this photograph. He was raised in this house in Gloucester, fought in the Civil War. And there are others. John Bolt Jr. brought home either a friend or a servant, Joe, who's buried in Boston Common. But as far as building boats, apparently not. And the other thing is very quickly, as with Japan, when moved in, their technology was so far advanced because the herds by the middle 19th century were bringing paddle wheel steamers. And then the Chinese were hiring American firms to be local shippers. So the herds were taking products up and down the rivers with the steamships, which China just didn't have. And the Americans had to bring the boats up in carts and they'd be assembled in China because of Chinese law. Yeah.
Yeah, how would you grade Quavo with like Taipan and Noble House as far as like the historical background?
Those novels?
Yeah, the Canton and you know, that whole, I mean, I read both books, they were fascinating, but I don't know if they had any.
You know, I haven't read them, and I think they're all, that kind of book would be based on history, but then they have to boost it, they gotta make it exciting.
Oh, yeah, nothing about the
The
characters,
affairs.
but you know, he did get into how, you know, Canton was the only place you could land, and Macau was the only place you could live. And you know, the protagonist like sneaks up the Pearl River and you know, infiltrates the.
Yeah, I believe it. I believe it.
And gets caught, of course, and there's all kinds of drama involved with that.
And when he gets caught, is he punished by the Chinese or not?
Well, they didn't catch him. They you know, they closed in on him, and then he had this harrowing escape.
Okay, because one thing that happened before the Opium War, when the Chinese still kind of had control, they wouldn't punish the Westerners. They punished the Kohan, like Hokwa, who was responsible for them. So Hokwa actually served time in jail, or some kind of imprisonment for a while, because some sailors had come ashore from a boat whose captain Hokwa was dealing with. So, you know, I don't know. I was in the herd house this morning in Ipswich, because I'm training to be a docent, and there's a little Chinese painting of a very beautiful young woman who apparently had bound feet. And they say she was Augustine Herd's Canton hostess.
He had the same thing.
There's enough there for me to work with.
But he was able to explore it more deeply.
Yeah, right. Yeah, in a museum tour you can do that. Yeah.
Why couldn't they grow pepper here?
That's a good question. Same with ginseng. No. What's the story? I don't know. I should read it back. The question was, why couldn't we grow pepper here, or the Italians? The Italians re-imported it from Salem and called it Salem pepper. Couldn't they grow pepper? But I will look into that. And next time I'm here, I take it on faith. It was such a big deal and such a monopoly. There has to be a reason why people were doing it. Yeah.
There used to be something called the Salem Rum Company. Was the rum trade or the cod trade involved in China at all?
Not really, and I'm not an expert on this. Rum was huge all around here, and Ipswich and reviving rum companies. Some of that was the so-called triangle trade, where the molasses coming from the West Indies or from Suriname would come here, be made into rum. The rum would be exported, maybe to Europe, maybe to West Africa, and then captive Africans would be carried to the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations. So there's that, and it didn't really connect with the China trade. What was the other part of the question?
Cod.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. I said these are the first millionaires. There were some 100,000 theirs, because there's the codfish aristocracy that people talk about, like John Hancock. They were very wealthy. They built nice houses, but they didn't build things like Chestnut Street in Salem. How many people have walked down Chestnut Street? Yeah, I mean, it's like Nantucket. It's like, it's amazing. Those people, that was not the codfish aristocracy.
Wonderful talk, by the way. But you mentioned the East India Marine Society, where the captains all brought back their times and put them up in the museum and Salem. Well, I remember that room, the East India Marine Hall, in the Peabody Museum when I first came to this area 20 years ago, and it's gone. And where is all that stuff? And why did they do that?
Why did they do that?
It's so fascinating. And honestly, I know teachers who won't take their kids there
Yeah.
because they lost the original income.
There's a book called A Sesquicentennial History of the Peabody Museum by a really famous Boston historian. It was written for the 150th anniversary for 1949. And he talks about a dumpster being in an alley outside a window of the museum, and curators just throwing like stuffed owls out. And then these two kids took a stuffed owl in the story in the book, and a cop tries to bust them. It's at night, they're stealing from the museum, and then they still have the penguin with the long neck. Yeah. Yeah, the coyote, they got it on 495, that's gone. My kids love that. Yeah.
It's very interesting that at that time the Westerners were bringing here all the china and cloth and so on, but now the Chinese are buying it all back. They really do.
Buying which back?
They buy everything that they were exporting. They're buying it back now. They're very wealthy. They're paying
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yes.
Some people are wealthy. I mean, there's a billion people over
And
there.
another thing I learned last year, Captain
Trask, yeah.
Singh, originally, he traveled primarily to Russia and southern states here because in his ledgers he had rum bringing back from South Carolina and so on. And so, why wasn't he involved in the Chinese trade?
Well, the other thing to understand is that there's a huge amount of trade everywhere, and it just kept growing. The other thing is ships kept getting bigger. So the Baltic was where you went to get things like iron. Iron bars were really big. A lot of countries didn't have iron. Lead from Spain. There are all kinds of natural resources. And once, during the 19th century, the growth of world trade just exploded. And it wasn't that expensive for ship owners to have crews sail 5,000 miles. Yeah. But I don't know, it's interesting. It's a huge subject, and you could do a whole thing on global trade in general. Yeah. Yes?
Was there a stigma, or was it illegal for these traders to be in America? Were they stigmatized for trading in opium?
That's a great, great question, and I'm not the person to answer it. I would say that it's a mistake to judge people in 1830 by our own moral standards, of course. There's a lot of bad things happening. Slavery was legal in 1830 here. Opium was legal too. You were allowed to buy drugs, there's cocaine in Coca-Cola when my mother was a kid. But there were people, like John Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker poet, who denounced the opium trade. And I think there was one company called Oliphant and Company in New York that refused to participate. The other traders called Oliphant and Company Zion's Corner. Like they're holier than thou. They stood out for keeping out of the trade. And one of the companies built a trading ship called the Greenleaf Whittier, in honor of this Quaker who said, no, don't do it. But it was a minority view. And drugs weren't illegal here until after the Civil War. And I think partly it was all the wounded soldiers that became addicted to morphine and stuff like that. But it was illegal in China all along. But, it might have been illegal in Peking, but Canton was 800 miles away, and the Chinese merchants wanted to make money too. And that's how Hoko got $26 million. Yeah.
You had a couple pictures of the Sturgis's family there.
Yeah.
One of that family founded the Emmanuel Church, which is on Masconomen, the one who lived on this point. But I wasn't sure which. I thought that one that fought in the Civil War and lost in the war.
I don't know. I know that they say late in life one of them built a chapel, so the house must have been right near the
Yeah,
chapel.
the house, the estate was there.
Yeah.
It was Russell Sturgis, because that's.
But they're all Russell Sturgis. And then there'd be Nathaniel Russell Sturgis, and then one of them dropped in Nathaniel legally and became Russell Sturgis. Help me out. Yeah.
Also, a question, did any of these presumption, the American government had consuls in one or more of these trading ports. Was there any conscious effort from these merchant families to supply individuals with service that have been relying on their own factors? Looking at America?
That's a good question. I don't know. Okay, he's asking if there were consuls that the U.S. government had in various important ports, like in China, to provide services to traders, because people were getting all kinds of fixes. Or were people left to their own devices and they were trying to work out everything by themselves? I really don't know. I think early on, you were on your own. China did not recognize the U.S. or any European country as a peer. They weren't countries because China was the celestial empire, and there weren't two of those on Earth. So how could you have an ambassador? And sometimes they say Caleb Cushing was the first ambassador to China. He was sent by President Polk, I think, in 1842 to strike the same deal the English were going to get after the Opium War. Like, whatever England gets, we want it too. But that doesn't really make him ambassador, because China still didn't. We were the flowery flag people. That's what they called us. They looked at the American flag and just thought it was a flower decoration. Yeah.
I think we just have maybe one more question.
Okay.
Have you come across, in your work, George A. Dixwell from Gloucester? Who
No.
was an opium agent stationed in, I think he was Macau. And so my memory's a little hazy. The portraits of his parents are hanging up in the Sargent House Museum.
Oh, okay.
And it was said that he married the daughter of one of the largest Chinese opium factors, even though this was illegal.
So a Chinese man.
Yes, well, that person's daughter.
Right.
And then because this was such a scandal, he raised his son and educated the son in Europe rather than bring him back to the U.S.
Because he was Chinese American.
Yes. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say something Madame Butterfly.
Something like that.
Yeah, really.
And the one other thing I would go on to, I mean, this is great, I learned so much, but there was, again, the extension of this was what was called the Chinese slave trade, where our captains would take these almost forcibly, have these addicted or starving people at the port sign contracts for 7 years and take them to what were called the Guano Islands off the coast of Peru and have them work on these treeless, horrible...
Yeah. It sounds like being in the British Navy. That's what we did for the War of 1812. The British sailors are going, this is terrible. I'm going to work on an American private ship. Much better deal. But yeah, who
These
knows?
people are virtually enslaved. And the conditions they endured on those vessels going to South America were as bad as any slave ship. One of Sergeant, actually, from Boston described it, saying 1,000 naked fools are underneath the decks.
I hope those be the best.
Thank you so much, everyone.